There we are. Okay, welcome to our mass timber meetup by the Tallwood Design Institute. As Evan said, I was doing a self-led research project over the summer with Tallwood. And so this is a meetup with some of the people I interviewed during my research process and just generally about the things I was interested in. So I started my research with just looking at general overviews of what the benefits are of using mass timber, and started looking at how the relatively new histories of the Living Building Challenge, which was established in 2006, kind of correlated with the United States' use of mass timber in terms of timeline. And so I started looking at why certain living buildings use mass timber while others do not, and kind of got into this main question, which is in bold down here. How do the requirements of the Living Building Challenge interfere or complicate the utilization of mass timber as a primary structural material? So my job here is just to give you a little brief overview of the intersection of mass timber and Living Building Challenge. So looking at the question of what is a Living Building Challenge, they have this quoted on their website. It's to make the world work for 100% of humanity without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. So I really see it as being two-sided, both environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable, which I think is a really unique part of this green building certification, where almost half of the petals are looking at social equity and sustainability for the people involved in the project and how the land affects people, as well as the environmental aspects, which are typical of green building certifications. So version 4.0 of the Living Building Challenge allowed a more inclusive of budget and restrictions by creating a tiered system of certifications. And Karen can talk a little bit more later about the core certification with involvement in a recent project. But the most typical certification is the full Living Building certification that has all 20 imperatives checked off within each of the 7 categories of the living building. But each of these, they are spanning from 100% building energy efficiency all the way to every single requirement met. So this wheel shows each of the 7 categories, which are called petals. They use the metaphor of a flower a lot in the Living Building Challenge. They're all organized, all of the imperatives are organized in each of the categories. So a pretty classic example in the Living Building Challenge within water is to reuse and recycle 100% of the water on site, as well as an example in energy is to source 105% of the energy from the location on site. So in terms of correlating with mass timber, it really is involved in the materials petal, the health and happiness, which is involved in indoor air quality, which is impacted by all the materials in the building, and beauty, which has to do with biophilia and people's access to nature and warmth, and wood having an impact on that. So within the materials petal of the Living Building Challenge, there's 5 imperatives. The Living Building Challenge is very complicated and has like a 100-page document of the full thing, and then 100-page documents of each of the categories. So it gets a little bit complicated. But here's the materials petal kind of broken down into these 5 categories. And I'll point out specifically how it is impacted by mass timber use. So the imperative called the red list is looking at how 90% of the materials by cost within a project should exclude any of the red list materials, which has to do with volatile organic compounds and different toxins that people don't want in their built environment. And so in terms of mass timber, formaldehyde is often added in adhesive resins that glue together the mass timber elements. And so this can complicate projects, which we'll hear more from our panel about. The responsible sourcing looks at more specifically 80% or more of wood in a living building certified project has to be certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, so FSC certified. There are exceptions for harvest or salvaged wood, and Jacob can speak more on how this relates to LEED versus LBC in terms of responsible sourcing for the PDX expansion project. But the FSC is a large impact on mass timber buildings in living building. The living economy sourcing has this tiered system of location-specific sourcing of all the materials in the project. So 20% must come from within 500 kilometers, 30% within 1,000 kilometers, and then 25% on top of that within 5,000 kilometers. So this adds some complication when you pair it with the FSC certified. You need 80% of the wood being sourced by FSC, but also if you're using that as a primary structural material, it has to be coming from pretty close. So we'll talk about location-specific challenges as well. And then net positive waste. This didn't seem to be typically an issue with mass timber, since a lot of mass timber production is in prefabrication, so it minimizes waste at construction sites. But generally 90% of wood by weight has to be, all the waste has to be diverted from a landfill. And then this is an imperative that kind of summarizes the rest of the imperatives. It is in regards to the tiered system. So the core certification has to do a little bit less than the other ones. So for example, this only requires 50% of wood products to be FSC certified. So it's just kind of wrapping those all in another imperative for the lesser certifications. So the main topics that we'll be discussing as a panel are sourcing with mass timber, embodied carbon, cost, the red list, and biophilia. And so now we'll get into introducing all of the projects that we have experience with the panel. So
we're going to introduce our projects and kind of our so we're using this as contextual. We take the theoretical and what we've all learned. Sorry, Joslin, sustainability leader, engineer. But what we're going to do is talk about, we have a project experience. I actually have a wonderful good fortune to have project experience with everybody out there, which is really cool, and ongoing project experience. So I'm gonna start off with our PA building that we're in right now, and I wanted to make sure I'm going to use. But we want to make sure that some of the specific things that we might not talk about in terms of the mass timber are touched on, so you understand kind of the concept of this building, since we're existing in it right now. Living building will be certified actually soon. We got everything that's been accepted in the audit. This is a version 3.1 living building. So it's different than the 4.0, and it had a lot of things were interrupted because of COVID. I mean, this started being erected literally May of 2020 is when I had all kinds of shots of completely empty streets of downtown Portland as each level went up, one level per week. That's how fast the building went up. So we were still in a situation where it was living building certification version 3.1, which was a little bit different. But so that at that point, we didn't have that positive waste, that positive water, that positive energy. This building does function that way because we talk about how do you get 105% of your water from on site. That doesn't compute. Well, it's because you reuse some that you do get, so you get that extra 5%. And so this building actually does do that. But it's not exactly the same as what the version 4 is right now that we look at on the projects. Two kind of key elements are the building itself. That's 57,000 square feet, 5 stories. It is the first building, and I think will still be the first building to be certified that is not from an institution or a foundation or something that is nonprofit or that oriented. It is a for-profit, developer-led spec office building. Now, granted, we knew that we were going to take 3 maybe 4 floors in it, you know, all the things that go with it, but we pay rent to the building. Evelyn, it was great. Evelyn, you know, handled the developer part of that, and it functioned just as a standard. Everything had to pencil out, as they say, but everything had to be accounted for in the pro forma. All the services, all the ads, and the things we're going to talk about with some of the board decisions that we made had to be accounted for as a building owner, which is not PAE, and as a landlord. So those presented some interesting challenges, interesting opportunities for growth. That's what it is. And along with that, we wanted to make this a building that would be here for 500 years. We're all about sustainability and resilience, and in order to do that, anybody that works in historic preservation, you know that things that are attractive and people connect to is what gets preserved and reused, right? I mean, that's just from my design background, that's kind of how it is. So it has to be attractive and functional and work well, and people need to connect to it, but it also has to be standing 200 years from now and 400 years from now. And for this location, that means accounting for the cascade, which is category 9 earthquake. So we did seismically upgrade the wood and concrete structure, not necessarily the hangars for all the MEP systems, but the building is category 4, which is the same as a fire station, an emergency center, hospitals, that kind of thing. So it not only won't crush you when the event happens, you'll be able to get out safely and be able to come back in and say your business operations better. That was a key piece. And so that's dollars, right, in the cost of the building. But we like to emphasize that timber is a huge part of the success of that. And so we were really committed to that all along. So that's 2.5 of my 3 minutes, right? Yes, a developer budget. There's a little bit of a rent premium. Oh, the other cool thing is our water system, which I talked about, but we actually do. We'll get a bottle of it when we have a break here. The urine and the leachate out of the waste streams is collected separately and is dried, and it produces a really valuable agricultural fertilizer, which is struvite. And so we have powdered struvite that's actually available for sale by the service that's doing it. And we have examples of the different stages of drying downstairs in the mechanical room and all that cool stuff if you go to tour. And also the liquid version, which is once that's dried and separated, then the liquid it's all something, but I'm going to take a bottle of it, but it's all packaged in there. So that's just a cool. From our building standpoint, you can see this is what everybody notices, that you don't get to see that cool view with a rooftop full of solar. This is like the same picture that all of us have from probably June 2020, because each one of those levels literally went up in a week's time. Okay, that's it. And then at the bottom are some of this is from the Canfor mill. Is that right?
This is our mill, yeah.
It's Smartlam. Okay, I couldn't tell by that. Okay, so we have more of those. We have more of those photos of things. So we have a really fun wood story that it's just a fun story. Alese and Rachel back here, and some ZGF folks and I, and some of our leadership got to have. We know exactly where our timber came from. Exactly where it came from, because it was really interesting. The biggest challenge was getting enough FSC mass timber close enough that it would have the right kind of carbon footprint, embodied carbon in it. We were bringing it from New Zealand. We weren't bringing it from Austria. Just brought it from up in Penticton, British Columbia, basically. And we can point to where the forests are, but another piece of that is there had to be enough FSC certified timber for them to be able to fabricate everything that we needed and deliver it on site at the same time. I mean, when you think about this, that it's a substantial amount of timber, because it is our structure other than the core and the floor diagrams. So we have a big big hairy problem that we identified early on, and it turned out to be a really crazy fun story and opportunity. It was literally an opportunity, and we wound up with exactly the right amount of lumber. We had to go to get it, just because okay, interestingly, this was about the same time that all of us that had been working on the Portland airport, like including PA and Jake, we knew the roof was coming. And so literally the conversation was, do we need to get our timber, grabbed before another one of our clients needs it for their project? And it turned out to be a whole different animal that Jake's gonna talk a little bit about. But there's that kind of conversation just because of the tightness of the resources. Locally, our location here at Oregon is only, 300 miles from a lot of places, but you have to go that far to get the FSC timber. So that's kind of my big end.
The other notable thing about the PAE building is it's the first living building challenge to use CLT.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Candida or Bullet Center didn't?
No, it's LVLs, I believe, in glue.
Yeah.
But CLT provides its own challenges within the adhesives. They have other red listed ingredients other than formaldehyde. Which I think, yes, exactly.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna hand it off to my friend and my conspirator, Andrew, at FFA. I'm getting to be a part of this project too in a wonderfully rewarding way. And so this is the Blue Lake Park Operations and Maintenance Building.
Yeah. So yeah, these are two images of the project here. The client is Metro, public client, who manages all the nature areas around the region, and definitely a smaller scale, but a unique thing is that Metro has adopted the Core Green Building certification, so the condensed version of the Living Building Challenge standard as their baseline for all new construction and renovation. The images here are of a new office that we're constructing for, designing for them. They have an existing warehouse on site that is also part of the project, and that's going to be renovated, and all the office uses that are in there, along with a lot of other things, are going to come out and be separate. But yeah, I'll be talking about it more through the lens of achieving the still very high, ambitious standard that is Core Green certification. A smaller scale project that has just municipal public budgets, and how we're able to deliver on that in different ways.
This is, I'm not from the area originally. This is out in what technically is Fairfield.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like right against the.
It's right along the Columbia River. It's 8 miles east of the airport, and yeah, it's in a
huge,
pretty well loved park. And so there's other sensitivities around the site as well. Yeah, we'll be able to get into it.
So I can introduce myself. I'm Alese, Ashuckian. I work for Smartlam, and I am part of this panel discussion because I worked on the PAE project along with Karen. I was working for Smartlam at the time, who was the mass timber supplier for the glue lamp and the CLT. And my role in working with the project team was to help coordinate, as Karen was alluding to, our FSC source lumber, getting all of the ingredient information from our glue formulas incorporated into our declare label, so that we can provide that material transparency and kind of meet those pedal requirements on the material side.
I have a full slide for you after this one.
Okay.
You have your own whole slide.
Okay. So I'll leave it at that.
No, it's fine. Jake, it's behind you.
Yep, so Jake Dunn with ZGF Architects, in our Portland office here. I'm a full-time sort of sustainability coordination staff, so I've got the, I think, really lucky position to be able to work across multiple projects at our firm and now across the country to try to help these project teams make their projects more sustainable. That's everything from looking at mass timber sourcing to certification support to working with engineers like Karen and crew on mechanical system design. I mean, it's really just all over the place. We're going to talk a little bit about the Portland Airport. It's not a living building challenge project, so it's not really well fit within our kind of theme for today, but the sourcing story we think does have some implications for the way that we might see these types of sourcing requirements in certifications as they evolve into the future. both in terms of the way that LEED has kind of changed their certification requirements and how LBC have to that in the future as well. So we're all going to talk a little bit with Karen and Alese and all the folks up here on the PA Living Building project, and also talk a little bit about the airport as well.
Yeah, I gave you that slide up there for
Oh, yes.
the local resources. I just felt like that was such an important part, or we felt like that was such an important part of the story when you sent me that. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, we just released it, as you might imagine, we're going after more airport work after the PDX project. And we created a booklet that was trying to condense, 7 years of work into a 20-page issue flip book that we could hand out at various conferences. And we had a spread on what it meant to do the sort of direct, local, transparent sourcing. So we have some of the highlights about the sourcing, but we really kind of went to this level of analysis in terms of the 13 different landowners, I think 4 different mills and various different fabricators all located on the same map to try to understand, the very beginning of that project, we set out to understand where it came from and to be able to point to specific components and a point on a map to say this is where it did. So it's sort of fun to kind of go through the exercise, greater map finally to actually kind of tell that whole story. So it's fun.
So can we have a Lisa slide? It might be a little busy visually, but we just,
All right.
oh, where'd it go?
It's right
Oh,
there.
there it is. So it's like the nuts and bolts. This is, the backs, it's like the back of house stuff that we have to deal with. So the clients get the cool things.
Yeah, so this is a flow chart that is basically an excerpt from our environmental product declaration. And so it really speaks to a lot of what the Living Building Challenge is trying to encapsulate and looking at all the different petals. For the mass timber production, our process starts with the material procurement. So the wood fiber we're using, where it's coming from, if there's chain of custody, what are sort of the certifications around our lumber, what are the harvest practices, and then with each step of the process, right? How do you get that? Where is that lumber located? How do we get it to our facility? And then once it gets to our facility, that manufacturing process, so the energy encapsulated in that process, as well as the waste that is produced in our manufacturing and fabrication process. Karen was mentioning it before, but a lot of the advantages with prefabrication come with being able to use as much of our material as possible, and then whatever is left over we can use for pellets or for sawdust, and we kind of can reuse that that waste to make that a more efficient process. And then with that, there's the shipping out to the job site. And for the PAE project specifically, our lumber came from the East Kootenays of British Columbia, about 200 miles from our production facility our Structural's production facility in Penticton. And then that was about, I can't remember exactly, but just under 500 miles from Portland. So it was a really clean and clear path to get from East Kootenays to Portland.
Train 1, train 2.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah.
So if you advance the slide. So this is the other stuff. I have them credited probably wrong.
No, it's
but you
fine.
sent so many
Yeah.
fabulous photos.
Yeah, so, and basically in my sharing the photos with Karen for today, I wanted to show kind of what goes into the process. So for the PAE project specifically, we worked with Canfor to source our FSC lumber. So they have the mills in the East Kootenays. And so this actually, I'm blocking it, but this is a photo of their Radium Hot Springs mill. So that is one of their FSC mills. I believe it's about 440 miles from here as the crow flies. So it's within those distance requirements, which is kind of an exciting discovery as we were looking, developing the project and looking at different lumber sourcing options, that it met FSC and it was also within that mileage that FSC was targeting, or LBC was targeting. And then the project on the bottom left really shows our glue.
That's why I put it up.
Yeah. Yeah, when we're looking at the declare label process and the material transparency, the glue formulas are really where we really need to have that transparency, and where a lot of those red list ingredients come into play. Specific to this project, So in 2018, the PRG 320, the standards for manufacturing, changed the requirements for the glue formulas due to fire testing. Previously, without having any fire retardant ingredients in the wood, they were experiencing delamination of the bottom layer of the CLT during fire tests. And so they changed the glue formula to require fire retardant within the glue formula, so that would not occur in the event of a fire. But with that, that made it more difficult to meet the requirements of the red list. So working through that, reporting out specific to this project, what the percentage, so in the total CLT panel for the declare label, you're reporting each ingredient as a percentage of that product. And so in 6 7/8 inches of CLT, how much of that is wood fiber, how much of that is your finger joint hardener and the finger joint adhesive, and how much of that is your face bond adhesive. And then within that face bond adhesive, how much of that is your fire retardant. Exactly. So that was a fun process of kind of working with our suppliers, our glue suppliers, and our team to understand how all those ingredients played into the panel to create the declare label.
I just thought it was cool stuff.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you guys will get to see the technical stuff very often. I know I don't, so.
Yeah. And the declare label is something that was created with the Living Futures Institute, but it's basically like nutrition label, but for building ingredients. And so when we're talking about material transparency, that was a lot of Alese's job in making sure that these declare labels could be produced within different materials, because that is an additional requirement to the Living Building Challenge within the materials imperative. So I think we're now kind of opening up to questions. We have these topics of biophilia, the red list, which we were just getting into, cost, embodied carbon, and sourcing. I don't know if everyone's interested in particular items, but we can bounce around. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, one is how much further do you see rain will have to go before this becomes more widespread, especially we still not there yet, but the ongoing shift from prescriptive to performance-based building regulations. So what else do you still see needs to change the regulatory environment to make mass timber CLT widespread?
I would say grow more trees. I mean, I'm not joking.
Are you asking specific to the Living Building Challenge or mass timber in general?
Well, yeah, just in general, so make it more of a widespread kind of framing as opposed to it's still very niche of application, but there's potential to grow it wonderful magnitude, and honestly, the regulatory environment is amenable to it.
Well, and I'll jump in on that regulatory environment. We say it's it's considered a kind of a niche or a specialty. If you take a look at the 6 projects that are on the boards behind you, those are all, well, okay, the court doesn't count as mass timber. Does it count as mass timber?
Roof does, yeah.
The roof does, yeah, okay, so those are all mass timber projects. Some of them are living certified, and that's not all of them that we have. Those are just things that PAE has partnered on over the last 7 or 8 years, after the Bullet Center in Seattle. So these are, there's a classroom building at Georgia Tech. There's another kind of a classroom. How would you describe it, Shameka?
The agriculture education complex of the community college.
Yeah, that's so there. I mean, these are things that are the Beaverton Public Safety Building is not just a mass timber building. It's also essentially it's also got its own microgrid and all that kind of stuff. So it's a real high intensive, resilient project, again, a public project. So I think we already are seeing, at least on the coast, where there's the aesthetic, is attractive. If we can get the concrete folks who I love usually Canada to stop posting false stuff on LinkedIn all the time about how mass timber buildings are gonna burn to the ground because Grenfell Towers did in London, right? Like, there's no part of those things that connect to each other. This isn't stick built. It's not stick built, and the whole key with, regulatory, we're finding there are a lot of cities now that have places that have codes that are we're doing high rise. We're going to be very soon doing high rise mass timber in Portland, and not just Portland, in other cities, even on the East Coast.
I think that it's a great point though, because North America doesn't have a very robust industry of mass timber. And I think you're very correct in that, but Europe does have a much more. Exactly. And I think North America is projected to reach a higher level within the next few years. But I think in my conversations, I've also heard some challenges within the fact that mass timber can't be its own structural material. It has to be the primary one because it needs to be reinforced with, like the concrete core, like we see right here. And yes, exactly. And I think I've had conversations with you on this. Yeah, and so it's like performing, going through performance tests to make it its own structural material, which will be a huge help in making sure that its market can be enforced. Exactly, yeah, but I think the North American market being primarily in Canada and not in the United States is providing this kind of like lull in the market right now.
I might also add, I think from what I see, the number one reason why mass timber gets eliminated as an option is due to cost. Like, you can have all of these really grand and noble goals from a sustainability perspective, but oftentimes misunderstanding around the cost and the impact schedule and some of
the actual material cost. To clarify, is it the material cost?
Right.
Is it the construction cost of assembling a building?
I'd say both.
It's a combination.
And kind of looking at that overall picture, because when you look at the material cost of mass timber, it's definitely more than conventional wood framing, and it kind of can compare fairly closely to steel and concrete, but oftentimes the lack of understanding around mass timber construction can have, higher costs associated with that, and then they're not realizing the effects to the schedule that can be beneficial on the back end and help to reduce the overall kind of full cost of the project. So I'd say as people get more experience with it and work with people who have experience, I think there's education that is kind of connecting that feedback, but that tends to be, from what I see with people who are not as experienced, but that tends to eliminate CLP as an option.
I would agree with that. I was gonna say, from a code standpoint, I think Evan's group with the post of the evening Tallwood design are really tackling a lot of the challenges that are facing codes, and that's more about research based and getting them in front of people. But in our experience, cost and construction and the actual labor of things on our project for Blue Lake, the renovation also needed to have a seismic upgrade, and because it's a living building and we wanted to have a good embodied carbon story and all these other positive environmental stories, we're like, is it possible to do a combination of concrete for shear walls, but for any kind of elements that would typically be steel, can we use blue lamp? And so we went through the design process, and then our contractor came back and said the labor and all the joinery associated with that is just going to outweigh pretty significantly. And so that's what backed us off of mass timber in that particular application. But
Well, we did do we early on, and Rachel, I'll put you on the spot. Rachel has been a big part of the carbon analysis for this building. Your structural engineer has got to be a fan of mass timber. Okay, find structural engineers that are good at it, that it's no big deal. They can make it work. And that is probably the first thing I would say, even before the architects, even definitely before the building systems engineers, because they have to be able, they're the ones that have to make that call. And so I know we did do an analysis. We did it for embodied carbon, but I think they did it for cost also.
I think initially it was cost.
So concrete versus a steel versus the mass timber, with the concrete that's required. We didn't need steel in here, but we did require reinforced concrete. And the cost was, I don't think the cost was, you got it?
I've got the numbers if we wanted this go through that real quick.
I was trying to bring it up on my phone when you said.
Yeah, no worries. So I got the cost numbers here. And so KPFF worked closely with ZGF and PAE to understand 3 different fully kind of designed conceptual structural system getting, which I think is one like really amazing thing about this project. Like there was that data to look back on.
Yeah.
So there was a fully developed concrete structure, fully developed steel structure, and then the mass timber structure. So looking at the steel system as a baseline, if we think about $26 million was the total direct construction costs for this project, right? Roughly, 58,700 square feet, 5-story project. Mass timber versus the steel baseline was only about a 0.4% premium or 100K.
Yeah, think about that. I mean, it
Which
just
is
wasn't
very
that big.
small compared to what we're seeing, and this is sort of congruent with, I think building on what Alese said, the experience of the contractors is a huge impact. What we've seen looking at meta-analyses of like multiple national contractors, the premium for mass timber is $0 to $30 a square foot,
Right.
depending on program, size, building code, jurisdiction, whether or not your contractor can take into account, schedule decreases, whether you're taking into account proper, exposure of ceilings. But when you expose ceilings, you increase coordination. So you're taking that factor into consideration, right? Are you looking at the weight, looking at the Buckminster Fuller quote, right? Like the weight of the building's lower, so the concrete, can be sometimes less. There's less site work. There's so many things that go into it that we found. But there are some contractors that get it. I would say even like more important structural engineer to be able to really capture, to be comfortable with the risk associated with doing
It's the
something
risk,
that's not
right.
super,
Right.
straightforward to be able to capitalize on all of those. So what we found, at least in this case, with steel, it was 0.4%. It's $1, 70 cents a square foot versus concrete, which is a little bit more efficient in this case, right? It was a little bit higher. So it was a $650,000 premium compared to concrete. And there was a couple of reasons why we didn't go with concrete in general, but it was an interesting exercise. That is a 2.5% difference for an $11 square foot range. So depending upon the structural system, it was roughly $2 a square foot to $11 a square foot, or 0.5% to 2.5% for the same building, different structural system costs. Right, so that's a good.
Part of the story,
deal.
part of it too, because with all, we thought, I'm not supposed to say it that way. But we would have hoped that having so much timber here instead of steel and carbon, that we would have reduced the carbon footprint a lot more. I think it wound up being 27%.
I think it's about a 4% reduction
On structure, right,
then that equated to about 30%.
at 30%, yeah, because we still have a lot of concrete, and there's a lot of some of the concrete.
I think we went not just part of the carbon, but also by the aspect, right? Like there was a strong desire for it.
Well, and I mean, to be honest, when we talk costs, part of the living building, when you do a full living building certification, there's the carbon offsets you have to buy at the end of the project. And when metric ton of carbon, the equivalent offset jumped from $4 a ton to $11 a ton. But from the time I started at PAE in early 2018 to when we were actually having to buy that, you buy those carbon offsets for the total embodied carbon of your building. It had gone from $4 to $11 in 3.5 years, basically. And so $11 times 2,500 metric tons that we had to offset. It's not $200,000, but it's a significant number. So there's that number would have absolutely been higher with all concrete. It would have been higher with steel. And it's not apples for apples, but at least it's worth considering.
Yeah, it's roughly, I think, 40K for the offsets, and that's only at market rate. If we think about like what the DOE has said, the actual cost of carbon in, it's more around like $200 a metric ton, right? So if this project saved 750 metric tons, right, like that math is a lot different depending upon the way the carbon is valued. But I think, to Rachel's point, the biophilia aspects has been one of the primary reasons that we've been seeing clients really interested in mass timber. The carbon aspects are fantastic, right? In terms of like looking at scope 3 emissions, sort of the key ways for us to decarbonize our supply chains at like the highest rate possible. But biophilia has been like one of the biggest reasons why when we think about workplace quality, especially now with return to office, workspace quality is probably one of the biggest things that we get asked about, right? As architects, it's like, how do we make sure when you go to the office that it's something that's going to differentiate what you have in your house versus I'm sure some folks here have some really nice timber houses, but for the most part, right, being able to come to a space like this, the PAE has been a big differentiator. But yeah, in terms of the carbon, there's a big factor. I did want to throw out some quick numbers on the biophilia aspects. Someone's brought that up. The way that we've been talking about biophilia recently with folks. There's a fantastic report out there by Terry Bright Green. Has anybody heard about these consultants? A couple of folks, a little bit, right? They're a biophilia consultant. They just produced their second edition of the economics of biophilia. They identify a bunch of different building typologies and the key performance indicators that might go to a financialization of productivity and human performance in these different spaces. So we just presented to an office client where we're trying to pitch mass timber about absenteeism and presenteeism.
Presenteeism.
Right, everyone's probably heard of absenteeism, but presenteeism was new to me before I read this report. But this is a banking institution, so we looked at the kind of average revenue generated per worker per year for financially based institutions. It's roughly around $600,000. Right, so when we think about like your primary place of your investment should be in your employees. When we look at the average absenteeism, I don't think this has to deal with like pandemic or what it is now, but what it was before, it's from a study in 2018, is 1.2% or 25 hours per year, the average absenteeism. If we look at presenteeism, it's about how often we're at work, but we are suboptimal, right? Because we are uncaffeinated or we're distracted or the acoustic environment's not there or we're angry because of stress for some reason or we're thermally uncomfortable. And that is for 9 days or 72 hours, we are in that state. And so they've quantified this and they've looked at per worker per year, that's $17,000 loss in revenue generated just from lack of productivity. And these, albeit, are in industries where it's easier to financialize that metric, not necessarily creative industries. But for a 200-person office, it's $3.4 million, right? So when we talk about premiums, a 1.4% increase or 100K for mass timber to have any impact in that, right, really flips that equation quite a bit, right? And even going back to that, 100K premium for mass timber over a structure right now is fantastic, right? This was like the perfect building geometry to really make that happen. If you looked at any of your projects now, and if it was that same number, that is a fantastic deal in terms of how close those numbers are starting to come together. But it takes sort of the right place and the right time. But if you just take one little piece of that absenteeism out because the building has a higher quality, it can really be the most economically efficient way to recoup your investment.
And just haven't seen, honestly, that big of a premium. I've been looking a few years ago at the IPC stats about construction cost per square foot, and they're only mass or CLT is that much higher than the traditional wood frame, even on the IPC numbers. So has there been a change since, or are they fairly accurate, the IPC?
I'm not really familiar with that, but I'm
The
thinking.
International Building Code, so they have a,
Yeah.
yes.
I'm just not familiar with the study that they have that shows that.
No, it's in there every year they publish
Okay.
a benchmark exercise. They list here different types of buildings, the framings, and how much would each cost at the median. So US wide, so again, states could vary very rapidly,
Yeah,
but just taking a US median for each of those different types of structures. And
yeah.
I just did not see that CLT was that much more expensive per square foot
Okay.
than traditional wood frame.
Well, I'm gonna phone a friend here, and we have a couple of contractors in the audience. Does anybody want to speak to that? Because I'm also unfamiliar with this benchmarking, this, William. in the
Not gonna
back.
speak to that particular study, but I would offer that as you talk about the range associated with mass timber, we've done over 35 mass timber buildings. And so we've got a really good pool of data associated with it. Earlier, there was a discussion about you need the right structural engineer, you need the right general contractor. The reality is you need the right team. Where we work together, and we'll say we, because there's a number of people there, including the people at front row, where we've executed on a number of projects successfully. I say that you can bring mass timber with the right team almost to a cost neutral or a cost benefit. And there's definitely schedule savings if you have the right team and the right approach to it. And I think that's the beauty of it. The first project that we did in mass timber was 157,000 square foot office building built to suit. And we found that it was 4% cheaper and 4 months faster. So Jake, you have to like stretch your range down.
You've got to be negative, you're right.
But I think that's part of the opportunity, and it's like how you can collaborate and bring these things forward. It's becoming where mass timber with the right team is not necessarily presenting a challenge for a number of buildings that we do, because with the right team, it's evolving and you're innovating forward, and that's some of the fun to me in mass timber, and it's really the cost neutrality, you can get there with the right team, so. Maybe that's, that's really is proven, so.
To follow on that, I was gonna say. On the smaller scale municipal projects or on the community college projects that have their set budgets that are publicly funded. You do have to be creative, and biophilia, basically connecting occupants to nature, is one lens in executing that. So if you have these exposed timber products as the finish, then you're taking away costs of other finished materials. There's trade-offs with everything. You can see the baffles in here, and Evan and I were talking about it. You're gonna have to put some kind of acoustic treatment in the space. If it's not carpeted especially, but finding ways to get creative and have solutions do double duty like that. So you're connecting people to a natural material, you're making it a healthier space for a number of reasons. That would be a whole separate topic. Adds value to the project in ways that clients can get behind. It helps offset some of the costs. I think in the lens of the living building challenge, I know we had talked in the past week about some premiums related to FSC specifically, as opposed to yeah, maybe I guess just tee you up on that topic, where you have some more knowledge about that.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, FSC is a requirement of the living building challenge. So that was, at least for this project in particular, that was something we had to comply with. And so working with what we're certified to make, what lumber grades and species we needed for the project, what moisture content we need our lumber to meet in order to meet manufacturing standards, and who can provide that. That kind of narrowed it down to Canfor as our supply option, but with FSC there is a premium. And I know we kind of compiled some data on that. My numbers guy.
We've got some numbers.
Yeah. And he's a creative design professional, and so he's got his iPad with it. But it was only about $200,000 premiums for the FSC ad, which is surprising, because what was it, how was it, much was the total wood?
It's pretty low. Like, I would say that's a good deal, and I think that's generally what we're seeing from the Canadian supply chain, is that
Yeah.
the premiums tend to be a little bit smaller than what we've seen with some of the domestic supply chains. But at a $200,000 premium, that is a 14% premium on the supply, a 7% premium on the install product, so supply and install, translates to about 1% overall premium on the direct construction cost of the whole project. Right, so it's always hard to attribute value, right, to these types of premiums, but like when I think about, you know, like a building, which is the assembly, right, we think about it on both material scale, but really it's, I think the installed cost of the structure is what we're looking at as does this feel like we're getting enough value for it?
But even less than 10% of the material cost. I mean, because we've been talking about FSC since I started doing LEED certifications in 2005, right? FSC was in other parts of the country. It's viewed a little differently. There's more of it in some other parts of the country. But there's still a cost to it because of chain of custody, you know, not just the timber, not just the forest, but the mill, the fabrication, everything, you know, is really covered in that. But to have it be less than 10% of the material cost, of the installed material cost, to me, you know, we say, oh yeah, FSC could be anywhere from, I used to say between 5 and 25% when I would give clients, you know, design clients off the top of my head. NAUF, you know, now you're added formaldehyde substrates for cabinets and things. You know, there used to be a premium for that. It's almost all of that now. So I'm not saying it's all going to be FSC, but anything that's less than under 10% of the material cost to me is something I can really argue for. Yeah.
I think in this project in particular, we used like a lower grade of lumber for the mass timber, so that opened up our options as well. When you get into different niche products, and let's say like MSR or machine stress rated lumber, your supply just, it decreases the more niche that you go in that. And so with that, we were able to use, you know, we were able to compile enough lumber for this project. I know like other projects, let's say in the South, who have been looking at FSC, those options go down fairly significantly because there is a pretty limited amount of FSC Southern Yellow Pine available. So it's really a regional specific issue. And so like this project is, close to a great supply of FSC, but not all projects are. So that can be a challenge, I think, when considering living building challenge.
Yeah, let's take a step back real quick, talk a little bit about like why FSC in this case, right, going with this first one, we in LBC. Is there's a reason why the living building challenge, right, which is like, in my opinion, maybe other than passive house, is like the most stringent, most performance-based, most like aggressive and credible green building certification areas, right? We can say what we want about LEED, although I still think there's a lot of value in LEED, but the living building challenge, fundamentally performance-based, has a lot of backing to it. There's a reason why it's chosen FSC as the primary certification for its certification standard, right? It's interested in pushing the boundaries of continual improvement around forest practices. LEED used to be FSC in version, well, I guess pre-version LEED
It
34.
still is.
It still is, but there's now or equivalent, which has been opened up with the credit interpretations by, a lot of the other kind of certification industries to now include things like SFI, PFC, which, as Karen mentioned, it all depends on where you're at, right? FSC versus SFI is very different in the Pacific Northwest versus the Southeast versus Canada versus the Northeast versus overseas.
Well, even Washington versus Oregon. I mean,
Yeah.
there's kind of a different with the private timber industry, and it's been the basis of the state.
Mhm.
It's just a lot harder to get them to do something, in a little different way. I don't know if you've seen the difference between Washington and Oregon, but I had felt early on that it was there in terms of the number of forests and products that were available for FSC.
Yeah, I would say, so, one question that we talked about this panel was, let's say you're just an LBC project. Does that mean that you have to do European wood, which I don't even think would be allowed, right, from sourcing rating
What kind
standpoint?
European.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, yeah,
Is this been, yeah, so
it would have been okay.
does that mean you have to go overseas? Does that mean you have to go non-domestic? Can you do it like, let's say Oregon, Washington? Like, those are the questions that we were struggling with. If there's no clear answer until you like get a contractor on board that knows what they're doing and can engage the supply chain. But what we found is that fundamentally there are pathways, right? In Oregon, there's less now, but there's plenty of certified acreage, right? There's 400,000 acres of FSC certified forest in Oregon alone, right? But that's not really the choke point, right? Because if we just think about the airport, right, that could have come from a single 150-acre harvest, right? In terms of the amount of productivity that our, forests in Oregon have, right? All of that could have come from a single harvest. A single harvest, depending upon other factors. But there's still, forests in Oregon, it's the mills are the challenge, right, in terms of the mills that have their FSC certification, because a lot of the fabricators in the US, or at least in Washington, which could pull from the Oregon wood baskets, do have it, but there's very few, at least in this case, mills. We have one of them in the audience today, right? Collins Pine is one of the few FSC certified mills, right, that are around that can provide that. Mount Erie Lumber is another one, Boggin is another one, right? All of those two of those are in Washington, one of them is in Oregon. What we did with the port is that where we found where a mill wasn't necessarily FSC certified, we used Elk Creek, which was sort of like a broker mill to use as an in-between to actually transfer FSC credits to our incoming supply stream. So we worked primarily with a mill that wasn't certified, but used a broker to come in and apply those credits to it, which is how all of the kind of FSC credits are used in general, sort of like a rec.
Like an offset.
Yeah, sort of like, as long as they're buying, on a 1-for-1 volumetric basis, they can apply that credit. So you're still supporting sustainable forestry, but it may not be that stick wood that you bought, right? I hate having to explain this because it's a really weird system to try to explain to a client that there's still economic value, but it may not be the wood that's coming in your supply chain. That being said, there are more options in Washington. I would say there's still some in Oregon, more in Washington, even more in Canada, and even more.
Yeah, the mill chain of custody. I mean,
Yeah.
that's because that's their FSC chain of custody certified. It's the forest that's FSC certified.
That's right.
Correct, yeah.
And so the last thing, just to explain like why it's important, right? Because not a lot of folks off the top of their head explain the difference between Oregon, Washington, and FSC, right? In terms of the forest practices that are on the ground and why that might actually have some value. And without getting into too much, right? The idea of ecological harvesting comes down to maybe one principle, if I had to really boil it down, and that's diversity, right? Diversity on the landscape. Horizontal diversity, across the landscape in terms of size of opening, species, size of trees, species composition, all of those things, horizontal diversity. There's also vertical diversity in terms of understory, canopy, all of the different aspects of, how you go up in terms of the geometric structure of the forest. And all of the kind of ecosystem services that forests provide can be linked back to healthy, diverse ecosystems. And a lot of what ecological forestry tries to do is to have forest practices that promote non-uniformity, which is against efficiency, but trying to balance that to kind of create a way for there to be more ecological functioning. With FSC, one of the primary ways it does that is through the size of opening in the event of trees that are left behind, called retention, right? Wildlife tree retention. So Oregon, the base requirement for legal minimum is up to 120 acres, and it's 2 trees live or down per acre. It's less than 1% retention. Washington is a little bit different. It's up to, I think, 240 acre clear cut with 4 live trees per acre, or down trees per acre. FSC limits it to 60 acre max, 40 acre average, with a sliding scale of retention from 0 to 30%, depending upon the size of opening. So you do a 60 acre clear cut, you have to leave 30% of the trees behind, roughly. And what that does is it sort of promotes a diverse ecological or geometric structure across the landscape as you go from harvest to harvest. Those are the differences. We can argue till we're blue in the face about the value or the actual impact of those, but that is fundamentally one of the key differences between those. And one reason I think why LBC still backs FSC as their primary certification, right, for their forestry practices. In my opinion, I think that should be relaxed depending upon the region, but at least in our Pacific Northwest, it's still difference.
I'm gonna interject here. There is a survey that I got randomly in my personal Gmail, I think, from the Oregon Department of, does Natural Resources have forestry in it? Is Natural Resources who does like, the parks and the hiking trails and that kind of stuff? Whoever, so there's a survey out, that asks you how you use, who are you pointing to?
Is this, no, this isn't, is this the Oregon Department of Forestry or something, or?
No, you did too? Yeah, it's the Department of Natural,
I don't remember who the
it's,
department was,
it's
but
agriculture, it's whatever, whoever, is looking for input on the, how do you use the forest? How would you like to use the forest? I wanted to put that out there because everybody that's here and is at any of your, symposiums or anything, you all need to find that survey and take it. Because it's, I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions, a couple of them I felt were not the right way to ask the question, because they're gonna give a real skewed answer, like recreation, or like, recreational activities. They included ATV riding and canoeing and everything else. Okay, so I called them out on that, but that's something that, I promised you that I would get that. I can't find
Yeah, if
it.
you find, I'll forward it to the group for anybody that's interested.
Yeah, if you can
Yes,
find that, yeah, because everybody should participate in that, please, for all these reasons. So.
yeah, I was gonna say with the FSC versus FSC equivalent, it seems like LBC is committed to just being FSC for right now.
But they do the restoration, they do start to do the restoration projects, right? And
Yeah, so
beetle kill.
the exceptions they have are from using salvage lumber or
Low risk.
harvested on site. There's like very
Right.
stringent qualifications that they have for those products. Going through the process for the green certification, the percentage of wood comes down, but also the radius from which you can get the product also is reduced. So we've got that 300 mile or the 500 kilometer radius, and so that also further limits the number of suppliers that we can work with. Just thinking along the lines of the challenges that mass timber faces in its role going through some of these more robust certification systems, but.
Well, and we've had sort of initial conversations with LBC on if we were able to do sort of direct sourcing or tracking transparency approach similar to the airport, right, on future projects. Is that something that they would accept, right? So it doesn't have the third party certified chain of custody certification going down, back to kind of assure there's additionality in forest practices, but the ability to be able to track it back to a forest and understand their forest practices. They recognize the value of that beyond just the third party certification or label. So we haven't gone far enough in a project to fully engage to say if we were able to get it from this landowner and prove that through working with their contractor or innovative procurement, is that something that they would accept? I think it's an interesting question moving forward, because I think as we sort of move forward, like we said, FSC makes sense in certain areas. There's still going to be availability and cost issues for folks that want to go beyond that, because even all certifications don't give you where the wood came from specifically, right? If we want to know
Which
that.
we do know where ours came from, you know where it came from for the airport.
Answer to that question, please. That's intriguing.
That we were this close to setting up a meeting with the project before it went on hold. We actually didn't end up moving forward, but they were willing to at least meet with us to have the discussion, both about looking at alternative procurement methods for the FSC pathway, and then also looking at forestry-based offsets as part of the offset protocol. So right now it has to be from renewable energy or landfill gas kind of operations with a certain level of additionality requirement, and they were interested in looking at forestry-based offsets from local areas. So promising, but we didn't get further than that.
Yeah, you gotta have a project to let us do this stuff, right?
Yes.
Take it.
No, you'll push that and sure back. So.
Absolutely. Yes. Fingers crossed.
Well, transparency and forest management practices, right? That's even what FSC is about. And a lot of the cost of the FSC is in the auditing and record keeping and all the things that have to do with that. So if there's an alternative way to prove the case for the transparency and, validate what that forest management practice is, they just rely on those other groups because they're there, right? And FSC it was more global. It was more a global standard than, I shouldn't say global, outside the US standard that we've tried to apply here. And since 2001 or whatever till now, it's taken me 22 years to actually get people to have the conversation. And now they're like, they got sued for a whole bunch of things. So as SFI gets in the picture and, yada, yada, it's just, it's an ongoing thing.
But I think that you got the best of both worlds, right? And I think it was part and parcel of working with the supplier.
Oh,
They could not only provide
absolutely.
FSC, but help you trace it back to that origin. I mean, and that's applicable or appropriate for a living.
Well, I mean, I do have to call out Ed and Walsh Construction, sorry. For figuring this out, because when one of the designers at ZGF and I and some others said, Austria, we're doing a living building. Well, shipping stuff is really fuel efficient on big ships, but then it's supposed to come from the East Coast or go through the pan, whatever it is, And then the next one was Quebec, and then it was also Smartlam is in New Zealand, I think, right? There's one that's in New Zealand, but they're all coming, and so we fortunately caught it at the right time. And we're far enough along the project, the budget was in hand, and so Walsh, and then as it turned out, Carpentry Plus, right? Managed to come through, mostly because of the lease that she's able to figure out, I think.
Yeah, group effort, it was not.
Yeah, no, it's not. Hadley, do you have other things questions or things that you want us to talk about to your research points, or that other folks might have interest in?
I mean, we have a lot of backup questions ready, but I'd rather see what people are interested in the crowd. Yeah.
Where's that?
Well, basically between the layers.
No, I know where it's going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we determined that was 3%. The 3% was the percentage of the wet ingredients, the adhesives that would be in, let's say, a glue lamp, okay, which was only 3% of the total makeup of the whole thing. But we still had to do the advocacy and try to get people into, low VOC stuff is just out there.
Is there less formaldehyde intensive or stuff like that?
So I don't know so much about the formaldehyde. I know for the red list particularly, they have a red list exception for the non-urea formaldehyde because it's required in the manufacturing of the adhesive, particularly for glue lamps. I don't know exactly why or kind of how they got that red list exception. I was mostly involved in the fire retardant ingredients for the CLT. And in talking with, you can't really get rid of those ingredients and still meet the requirements of the PRG, and it's for a very valid reason. And so I was trying to work a little bit with our glue as Henkel was the glue supplier, so trying to get a red list exception in the timeline that the project was going forward. We couldn't get that. It takes years for them to review and get back to you. but it ended up being that you only have to report to like a certain, like 100 parts per million. And so because of like the small amount, there are 2 ingredients, and due to their small amount in the glue formula and the small amount of the glue in that panel, we were able to meet it through that 100 parts. It was less than 100 parts per million.
And keep in mind that the urea formaldehyde has historically been the binder for composite grades. It's not necessarily what's in all of these laminated and the veneers and those kinds of things. That's what is in playboard and part board.
I do want to give you a sense of where we're going, though, or where I hope we're going, because I think, this has been one of the issues with mass timber, that we can only get less bad versions, right? And eventually we'll get to a good version, but we're not there yet, and it's still probably better or, less of an issue than a lot of the other types of finishes and coatings that we put in the building. So by no means like this is causing a problem, but it's I think a place where we can grow from a mass timber industry. And so just a brief survey, I could probably talk for 15 minutes on glues, but for
No, not
brief,
15 minutes.
brief
No.
survey of where we're at, we'll do the 30-second version. There's formaldehyde-based glues, right? And then there's also now ULEF-based glues, ultra low emitting formaldehyde. So we can get to like less formaldehyde, but like how much is safe, it's hard to say, but that's still better, right? So there are options out there between certain suppliers that have better glues. There's also a melamine or urea formaldehyde-based that looks at pretty much the issue is not formaldehyde in that case, but it's the same off-gassing component as spray foam, which is cyanurate. So you have less off-gassing during its life, but if there's ever a fire, there's this other piece that could be problematic as well. So at that point, it's like pick your poison, right, in that case. And then in the far future, there's the kind of soy-based glues, which are available now in non-structural applications. As Elise said, there's structural applications that require non-delamination during certain, fire tests. What we've heard is that there is a way for that to become market viable and that it will pass the test. Of course, it's coming from a researcher from Oregon themselves, so like you can't really believe it, but believes that there is a pathway that it will pass. But the problem now is not necessarily the chemistry, but it's more of the market, right? Like which manufacturer is going to have a completely different gluing line just for this one niche product that maybe 3 architects in Oregon might ask for on any given project for like an LPC project. Right, so there's a testing cost for that, then there's a capitalization cost, and there's a market demand cost. That's the real barrier to moving this forward, because the chemistry is getting better and better.
Critical mass, just keep building momentum, critical mass.
On that point too, so Kai-Cheng Lee was a researcher at Oregon State who developed the original soy-based adhesive for hot press applications. And that, the IP for that was bought up by companies pretty much immediately for some, I think it was 20 years or something like that. So I do think if the cold set soy-based adhesive was developed and worked, it would take on pretty quickly.
Well, I mean, keep in mind, I may use analogies too often, but to me, some of these things, connect to other things in the past. I've been doing design work starting out when I came out of college in the 80s. All right, so I was an interior designer for commercial stuff, worked for architects. Did a lot of office design, specified a lot of furnishings, a lot of foam furnishings, and back then, California was the only one that had to ship fire retardant sofas and mattresses to. Literally the only state. And because I was in Ohio and we had projects all in that part of the country, that didn't really affect us. But if you were specifying something for one particular project, like all that long time ago, when you were pricing it and specifying it, you had to pick the flame retardant foam version of it. So think about that. Most of you have never even heard of something that wasn't flame retardant foam. And now we're taking the flame retardants out of those chemicals out of all these products. But after, over a very short period of time, I want to say 10 years, as I recall, pretty much there were 2 options. It was just the flame retardant. It's the same thing as the low VOC paints and everything else. You're not going to keep 2 production lines going, making things 2 different ways. If this is working over here, then you're just going to transition to that. And if you're talking all the foam upholstered furnishings that might go into the state of California, that was a lot of stuff that they would have had to keep those open for, but the whole rest of the country didn't care. We literally didn't care. So that changed over about 10-year time. All of this can become standard practice. I think kind of like what we were talking about here is what makes mass timber the automatic thing to think of, right? Which is what we want for all these reasons.
Back to the resin piece too, with you, Elise, were you saying, because it sounds like you guys are using polyurethane? Or is that not true? Some producers, I was under the impression that polyurethane based resins were the ones that were having issues in terms of delamination and fire.
Yeah,
So the MF and MUF resins weren't really having that sloughing off effect, where basically like large chunks of char were falling off. So that's when the flame retardants had to be added to the polyurethane resins, like over time in the PRG 320. So I was under the impression that they also had an exception for life preservation, safety, like factors.
okay.
Was that true, or is that not?
I mean, what Jake was saying kind of hit the nail on the head, where like with the PRG 320 2018 new thing came out, the structural, and they changed their glue to add it was the Pure Bond HB next to it, which a lot of manufacturers use. I don't know if it's like it might be, I don't know in my head, but to change the glue, like they weren't going, it was kind of a non-starter to change the glue because there's shutdown times, there's issues with that new glue formula. So I don't know if that kind of played into that as well, but I'm not familiar with that. So you might.
Gotcha. For some reason, I thought you were saying that the LBC had sort of like forgiveness for certain like red listed ingredients that are like.
So for that they do. So like I know like the formaldehyde piece, and maybe it's more historical, they have a red list exception where they basically targeted certain ingredients that are on the red list, that they allow them because they're required by the code. And so like the fire retardant, at least at the time of the 2018, when we were developing the declare label, that was the case for the fire retardant ingredients.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, AHJ and code requirements
Will
always supersede. The life safety is a big issue, like with lead, LBC, nobody's gonna mess with requiring you to do something that might put somebody at risk.
Mhm.
Anybody else? Paige, do you have any questions about biophilia?
No, but I was gonna say, I'm part of Green Plants for Green Buildings, and we have an ROI calculator that you can use to see the investment you have on putting biophilia into your space based on how much you're paying your employees. So people can see how much money you're saving based on presenteeism.
Yep.
You can slide the scale on productivity. There's a lot of studies that say anywhere from as low as 5% up to 15% productivity and creativity are increased by having more biophilic design in your space. So by having more productivity happening and that presenteeism going away, you're getting more work done in less time, saving money. And so it just shows you the bottom line by investing in having those biophilic elements. I do plants for interiors, so that's why
So tell me who you are.
very passionate about it. It's my job. But having that investment into your space can increase more productivity work, increase the ROI on the bottom dollar of the company. And I would say over 90% of costs that go into the building are actually spent on people, whether that's through salaries, workers' comp, all kinds of things. Most of your cost is going to human beings. And so I think it's hilarious that we spend so much time on that 1% of energy efficiency, like the light bulbs.
Okay, now. Come on. What's keeping us in
So much money that we're losing by not focusing on our people in general with mental health, and all those other things. So it's a broad spectrum. It all comes as a puzzle piece together, but 90% and 1% too. Like we should be focusing on how to create environments that are healthy for people in a built environment. So I'm super passionate about that. I just checked the website. It's not actually on there on greenplantsforgreenbuildings.org. We have a lot of research papers and studies on our website, but right now it's actually on my friend's company in Texas called VenturaHQ.com. They have the ROI calculator. So if you really want to, I can show it to you, but we're trying to get that calculator on the Green Plants for Green Buildings website itself, and it's still not there yet. Anyway, it's pretty cool. It still exists. You can use it.
I think one of the other pieces that get overlooked too, there's all the soft benefits, right, that are certainly get better research around, like what is the productivity increase. One of the more quantifiable aspects was the increase in rent, right, from having a premium office. Right, there was an upfront cost, which was not as big of an issue for the developer. It was really about the return on investment in terms of their upfront capitalization of the project. Right, so the fact they're able to do like premium office space is going to start to be defined by mass timber, I think, in general. Right, that it is going to put you into that class in terms of what you're now operating in being, and having increases in that can also help to pay for any additional costs associated with the space itself and construction type construction. But there's a really interesting stats on the PE building.
Yeah, we're just 10%, our rent is just 10% higher than a nice class A office space would be.
Yeah.
And we don't pay to ourselves, it's a whole other entity that owns the building, it's a, a group of people. One thing I was gonna mention about that is, we've always been saying that about green buildings, right, and healthy interiors, and what's gonna be the differentiator. I think the goal here, and I like to think of it this way, especially when we get to work on so many of these wood buildings, and you guys have this organization here, and it's amazing, is a biophilic interior, especially with a lot of wood emphasis and structural, natural components in terms of the way it looks, feels, what you can do with it, in fact, there are all these other benefits, but the occupying that space, you're not going to get to call it, hey, we have a wood interior, and that's what makes us cooler than the other guys in the spaces you're looking at. The idea is to get that to be a disqualifier if you don't have the biophilic elements in there. It's great to call this out and be special, but you also don't necessarily want to always be thought of as just special. It's, well, if you're not doing this on that, if you're not diverting your waste, if you're not doing these things, it's a disqualifier if you don't do it. I mean, that's where I like to think of it that way. I'm still having a hard time getting over that Metro organization decided, because I worked on zoo projects, lead certifications of the zoo projects, they do the zoo too, is using the LDC core certification as this is the test project, but it's in the standard, it's out there in the publication now. And so we're having to actually make it work, because it's like, okay, guys, we've told everybody this is what it's gonna be. It has to be that, and it can't be super hard to do. But that's such a step. I mean, that's just part of where we are in the location in Oregon and what Metro does for the area. That was just a big step.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting to be a part of that, and it's a learning curve for all of us, including the client, but delivering for them, again, it's about trade-offs the same way with acoustics versus putting things on display, the trade-off. If you are finding these other materials, or you're bringing something in that has an FSC premium to it, you have to find ways to save and be creative in other areas and to deliver on a quality project. So it's been exciting.
Where did you find your FSC? Did you mention it when we were talking about?
Bogan is the supplier right now.
Bogan, so domestic source out of Washington. That's provided.
Yes,
that's great.
I didn't know it was been found.
Yeah, we just started seeing that. It's funny that the compact zone project, it's been working with us and helping us understand what those costs are and finding suppliers. So
It was a whole clear label that had me going at it.
Well,
It's a clear label, we only need one.
Amplifies might have printed it too. Right?
No, I'm just.
It's exciting to see that scale, and I think it gives others confidence to kind of pursue that. I think what we've done, that which say alignment towards like net zero energy plus mass timber on an ag complex for community college. Again, a great demonstration project. Some of the things we've been doing with Jake on transparency and kind of bringing that in uniquely to really have clients who are interested in knowing where the wood's coming from. Is it, what are the harvest practices? Is there an opportunity for proud and small landowners and really kind of changing the landscape? People don't ask about standing aggregate in the concrete, right? People are very keen on understanding where the wood comes from because there's a connection. So it's great as we all continue to educate as an industry and create these opportunities to stair step forward, because it becomes easier the next time. We can find more challenges to do better, to be good. So
But I really love that because I think it's, as architects, we think all the time about like, what does it mean to like do a local architecture? To do critical regional development, right, in this day and age. And I think sometimes we fall into the knee-jerk reaction here, right? It's that like we're in the Pacific Northwest, trees grow here, so we'll put trees in our building. Right, but I think what we've learned with working with some of the great contractors that are here, right? Russ, William and crew, is that like getting into the supply chain and knowing where the wood comes from, being part of the history of the industry has been so fruitful in terms of like where that's taken us to understand the relationship between economies and social, industries and environmentalism, right? All of that has been such a fantastic like vector of growth, I think, for us as architects and designers, and connecting our buildings back to the places that actually create them, the people that steward the resources that it takes to create built environment. It's been such a fun journey.
Speaking of which, where it came from, I'm surprised you haven't picked up and said anything. Okay, but we were gonna get to go see the forests. We were gonna get to go see the forest that this building was coming out of. But it was, when everything was kind of settled out, it was February, right? It was February. I won't tell you the year because you'll be able to guess. Nobody goes to a forest in Canada in February. It's like, what are you gonna look at? What are you gonna do? So he said, we'll go. Rachel and I couldn't wait to go. We're like, what do you do? Because you said we could go.
We set it for April.
So we set it for April 2020. So think about what was going on in April 2020. We didn't get to go. None of us got to go. So you got, where you can tell where the forests are, but none of us got to go, and I will be bitter about that.
Yeah.
Well, so if we got to Canada, we wouldn't have been allowed into Canada, and we probably wouldn't have been allowed back in to the US, so yeah, we couldn't go. We could have seen the forests.
Evan, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think we ended on some really good inspirational thoughts and comments here. That was a really fruitful conversation, so thank you guys so much for joining us. I think we've got about a half hour left, so feel free to pelt our wonderful panelists with questions here. Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming. Keep your eyes peeled for Meetup. Talk soon.